that 2016 was the warmest year on record, a remarkable 1.1 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial period, sharply above the previous record set the year before, and in fact approaching the desired limit that was set in Paris.
Okay, I want to do a bit of debunking of climate alarmism, and I could have chosen any one of hundreds of alarmists. As you know, there's plenty of famous alarmists running around the place, all spouting a whole lot of nonsense that they've been taught, all this propaganda, alarmism, IPCC and UN nonsense. But what I've done is I've chosen this guy called Noam Chomsky, who seems to be some sort of hero of the left. I've hardly ever heard of him myself, but he's some sort of lefty hero. Okay, what's he about, this Noam Chomsky guy? Apparently he's an anarcho-syndicalist, whatever the hell that is. But it's described here. Now, he apparently likes Pol Pot. He was kicked out of Israel. They don't want him there. This is a Bernie Sanders supporter. Doesn't like capitalism or communism. Apparently he's a bit of a socialist, though. Quotes, which I like to see people's quotes. One is, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way. Stop participating in it. So he thinks the US and the West are actually terrorists themselves. I suppose that's part of his crackpot beliefs. Goes along with the climate stuff, I suppose. Anyway, another one is either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody's saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Hey, boy, does that fit in with what we're going to talk about now. But not from his point of view, from my point of view. He's the one that's actually repeating the conventional doctrines that everybody is saying, and I'm the one that is going to say something true, and it's going to sound like it's from Neptune to Noam Chomsky. Here we go. Now you're going to need a bit of patience here because we've got dozens of crackpot claims to go through. And they're all, like Chomsky says, the conventional doctrine. In other words, that stuff that's been thrown out by the IPCC and believed by practically all the media on the planet, practically all the politicians on the planet, practically all of academia. So it's going to take some debunking, but all we're going to do is use peer-reviewed papers and measurements. Doesn't conform with the narrative, so they're going to hate it. Okay. What was his first claim? We're 1.1 degrees centigrade above the reference period. This is the reference period he's talking about. The 1981 to 2010 reference period. And we are last month available, May 2017. We are 0.45 degrees centigrade in anomaly. So 0.45 degrees centigrade above the reference period. That's the anomaly. So he's way out on that. He's saying we're 1.1 up here. Now, what he's doing there is he's using fraudulent data. Instead of using the best data we have, which is the satellite data from UAH-MSU, Global Temperature Anomaly, interpreted by Roy Spencer and Christie, of course, UAH, USA, University of Alabama at Huntsville. This is the best data we have. Now we can flick down. We can look at this stuff, RSS, MSU. Now this used to be good data. collated by Dr. Carl Mears. But Mears in the more recent period has gone a little bit, you know, like the rest of them, started to conform with conventional doctrines. And you can see that here. He has altered the data. So the version published in May 2015 is in red. The most recent published version is in blue. And you can see they start to diverge about 1997. And now the anomaly is probably, well, I'd say 0.15 at least, centigrade above where it should be. So I would not use the RSS MSU anymore. It's become corrupted, as they say. Just like Hadcrut 4 is corrupted, the three major surface temperature data sets, NCDC, totally corrupted, and GIS is the most corrupted of all. But even that one only shows an anomaly of 0.9, even though it's the most corrupted anomaly of all. So strike one for Chomsky.
The election results came in from the United States. The conference essentially stopped. Nothing more to discuss. The only question was whether it would be possible to salvage anything from the wreckage with the world's most important country, the richest, most powerful country in world history, having all three branches of government committed to racing to destruction. What could be done?
Of course, what Chomsky's whining about here is the COP22 meeting at Marrakesh last year, 2016 November, took place during the US election. And you can imagine how deflated they were when Hillary Clinton didn't win and Donald Trump won. That would have been an absolute knife in the back to those people at the UN conference. Anyway, Chomsky claims here that just because the US has pulled out, Trump's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, that the US is racing to destruction. I mean, doesn't he know that the US has cut its emissions far more than any other participant? So apparently doesn't know, or seems to be totally oblivious that countries that he likes are racing ahead with their emissions, like these third world countries. And the countries he doesn't like, the capitalist countries of the West, are cutting their emissions. By 2030, China's going to increase its emissions by about 10 billion tons. The US is slated to cut its emissions under Obama by 1 billion tons.
Which is accelerated, of course, by the unprecedented Arctic heat wave, which gets radically worse every year.
Yeah, this is one of the most common claims and the most easiest, really, the easiest to disprove. I mean, it's just strange. The unprecedented Arctic heat wave that gets worse and worse every year. What are they talking about? This is the Hadcrut 4 Arctic, 70 to 90 North Arctic, since 1920 to today. April 2017. Where's the unprecedented Arctic heat wave that gets worse and worse each year? It was actually hotter in the 1930s and 40s than it is now. It's a mystery. The mystery. Can't they read a graph? I mean, a lot of these people, especially the IPCC, go back to 1950, they stop here. They say, oh, unprecedented Arctic heat wave. Oh yeah, what about the 30s and 40s? Wake up to yourself, Chomsky and whoever's claiming this Arctic melt or whatever bullshit. There's the data.
Sure, methane is far more dangerous than CO2, even though it's short-lived.
Here we are, claim 4. Methane is far more dangerous than CO2. Okay, let's look in the literature. Paper by Gavin Schmidt himself, Attribution of the Present Day Total greenhouse effect. Now what it said, to cut a long story short, what it says in Gavin Schmidt's paper is that methane is less than 1% of the greenhouse effect. And CO2 is 20% of the greenhouse effect. So how can methane be far more dangerous than CO2 when it's 20 times smaller in terms of its greenhouse effect? Just doesn't make sense.
A new study was released on the damage to the Great Barrier Reef, one of the world's greatest living structures, which is damage that's quite intensifying. And the report said that it's by far the most widespread and damaging of recent mass bleachings of coral reefs since 1998.
Yeah, the damage to the Great Barrier Reef. It's just amazing to me how American alarmists like Chomsky are so worried about the Australian Great Barrier Reef when it's 20,000 kilometers from them. You know, they only worry about anything in Australia if it confirms their worldview about climate change. In other words, if we get a cyclone, they're straight here. If we get a bushfire, they're straight here. Even though cyclones and bushfires have happened since the year dot and are actually lessening now than they have been for, there were most destructive cyclones and bushfires were in the 1880s, 130 years ago, but they don't say that. Everything's always destructive today. So they're trying to relate everything back to their belief system, which is man-made climate change, which is a complete fiction. You want to learn something about the Great Barrier Reef? Go to the literature. Here we are. Tropical cyclones, 48%. Crown of thorns starfish, 42%. 10% coral bleaching. That adds up to 100%. Where's the global warming? It's not there. What a surprise. Let's look at the Australian government's website on the Great Barrier Reef. They do mention the 10% of damage that is caused by coral bleaching events. Remember, that's within the 10%. And these events have happened in 1998, 2016. 1998 and 2016 were massive El Niños. So nothing to do with climate change, man-made climate change or global warming whatsoever. They're completely natural events that have happened since the year dot. And the other events in the middle here, bleaching in 2008 and 2011, was caused by an influx of fresh water. So just runoff of fresh water from flooding events, which are common in Queensland and have also happened since the year dot. These American alarmists, all they want to do, like Al Gore, Chomsky, down here in Australia in a flash sticking their nose into everything. None of their business. Like Podesta. We want to dig up coal. Podesta's here in a flash, sticking his nose in, spending millions of dollars to try to stop us from opening a new coal mine. Nothing to do with you. Get the hell out of it. We want 10,000 jobs from that coal mine. India wants to build it. It's because it's going to pull 100 million Indians out of abject poverty. And this idiot Podesta's stopping it. If he comes to Australia again, I'd put him straight in the slammer. That's where he should be.
Hansen says we're in danger of handing young people a situation that's out of their control, with precipitous rises in sea level, not too far down the road, other dire consequences.
Yes, Chomsky's brought up James Hansen. First thing he should be in is in a padded room in a straitjacket. That's what he needs. How many times has he been arrested now, this so-called scientist? You know what his PhD was on? Greenhouse gas warming of Venus. Venus isn't even warm because of the greenhouse effect of CO2, and he got a PhD because of it. Crazy. This is Hansen here. And he brought out a new climate study this year. There's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise in 50 years' time. Now, I recommend you look at Climate Depot to read about Hansen. Here he is being arrested for the third time. He was head of GIS for years. He was budging up all their numbers. That's why GIS looks ridiculously high. I also recommend Steve Goddard's website here. If you want to learn about Hansen and what he's been up to, all his fraudulent changes of the data at GIS and other places. This is some of the data that's changed. That's all HCN stations at GIS. This is individual stations that is fraudulently changed. There's hundreds of them. You can go through them all if you like. Of course, Hansen is famous for predicting the boiling oceans, that the oceans are going to boil. In other words, they're going to go up from the average of 15 degrees centigrade, like they are now, to 100 degrees centigrade. Does anybody in the world believe that's possible? The actual rise in the last few decades of the oceans has been 0.15 degrees, 1/6 of a single degree centigrade. And here we've got US temperatures that have been fraudulently changed by Hansen. So what was previously the warmest in the US in the 1930s was changed to be 1998. Here we've got more stuff from Hansen. Boy, this guy's been very busy. He's predicted that red line, which is warming oceans, in his paper in 2005. This is the actual temperatures of heat content published by Levitas in 2009. So very big difference of about 6 times, 600% error. These are Hansen's predictions from the late 80s, from 1988. Scenario A, business as usual. Scenario B, reduced CO2. This is by 2020. Hansen scenario C, CO emissions reduced to 0 by 2000. And the actual emissions of CO2 has been higher than the business as usual. So temperature, according to Hansen, should be way up here, about 1.6 degrees above the average. Instead, this has been the real temperatures here. Way down here, even below the scenario C, with no CO2 emissions after 2000. So the whole thing has been complete nonsense. This is Hansen's graph that he published himself in his own paper in 1975. This is his own graph, showing, which was correct, showing a peak in 1939-1940 and a large fall of about 0.8 degrees to 1970. That was the real temperatures. But Hansen's changed that. He's changed it to this. You'll notice that is the original graph, and this is his GIS graph that he published much later. He's lowered the temperatures. And in the first part of the century, right up until about 1950, he lowered the temperatures to make it look as though the 1930s and 40s warm period didn't happen, and also that there was a rising temperature up to the current, which matches the CO2 graph. You see? That's what he's done. Complete fiction. Now, later versions of GIS from James Hansen is this 2010 version. Compare it to his 1975 version, and you can see what he's done. The minus 0.4 in 1880 is gone. It's gone up. And suddenly, 1900 has dropped from minus 0.1 to minus 0.2. It's dropped down to minus 0.4 to minus 0.5. So it's made a very steep rise from 1900 to the present. That's what it's done to match the increase in CO2. This is what the guy's been doing. They've done the same, over at the CRU. Have a look. It was, the original graph was all around 0 from 1900 onwards. It was here. So it's gone down quite a bit. And even the 1930s and 40s has gone down as well. Instead of being peaking at 0.6 up here, 1939, 1940, the 1940 peak is now way down here at 0.3, plus 0.3. So we've got a very small difference now between 1940 and the 50s and 60s, which in the original graph were around minus 0.2. So they're still around the same place. This stuff here is all fraudulent as well, as we've seen from Steve Goddard. So there hasn't been this large rise. The real data is it's up here, then along here, then up here, then down, and we don't have this big rise here, so it's gone here. The 1940s, 30s and 40s, they're about the same as the present, round about what it is now. So this graph is a total fraud.
There are other studies that indicate that climate change is occurring faster than at any time over the last 100 million years, by some estimates far faster.
Yeah, one has to wonder where he's getting this from. I mean, it just sounds crazy. Climate change is happening faster than any time in the last 100 million years. Where's he getting this stuff from? Probably that crackpot Hansen. Here is the data. Lindquist, for example, shows nothing out of the ordinary as far as temperatures go. Lowell the same. Ocean temperatures, nothing unusual. No acceleration. In fact, it's decelerated in the last few decades. This is work by Goretsky, 2012. And here we've got the carbon-14 proxy for galactic cosmic ray flux in the last 1,000 years, which shows a very strong correlation with global temperatures and climate change, indicating that these climate changes had nothing whatever to do with carbon dioxide.
Last year, as you probably know, atmospheric CO2 passed the symbolic level of 400 particles per million. That's considered a crucial danger point. That's the first time in 4 million years.
This is what it's talking about. The ice core record. He's relying, like a lot of the mainstream self-styled climate scientists, they are relying on the ice core record only. That is what they rely on. That's what the IPCC relies on, nothing else. Okay, this is the ice core record of CO2. You've got the temperature there on the bottom, and you've got CO2 parts per million by volume up the top in red. As you see, they follow each other, or to be more exact, the CO2 level follows the temperature level. It always has in history. It has never done the opposite. Not even today it hasn't done the opposite. We're talking about cause and effect here. The cause is the temperature change, and the effect is the CO2 change, not the reverse. So cancer does not cause smoking. It is the opposite. Smoking causes cancer. It's cause and effect. Okay, now let's move on a little. This is going back a little further than the ice core record, going back 600 million years, in fact. Okay, this is work by Weiser for the temperature. The orange is Burner's Geocarb 3 record of CO2. That's the orange. And you can see those blue dots. That's CO2 by Royer, and that was published in 2008, and that is plant stomata record of CO2. Okay, we'll come back to stomata. Now, notice that the stomata record jumps up and down, bomb, 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 up and down, way more than the geocarb record. And incidentally, the stomata record jumps up way more than the CO2 ice core record. And we'll come back to that as well. Okay, let's look at the level of CO2. Okay, 500 million years ago, it was 7,000 parts per million in the atmosphere. It dropped way down during the 300 million year ago ice age, dropped down to about this present level, about 300, 400 parts per million. And then it went way up again, went back up over 2,000 parts per million, about 150 million years ago, and slowly dropped down to the level where it is now, according to the geocarb. Okay? The stomata record is different, and we'll come back to that. What is a plant stomata? This is a plant stomata. Now, what plants do is they take in CO2 from the atmosphere, and to them it's food. If there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, this is the main point, then the plant stomata gets smaller, because it's easier for the plant to take CO2 into the atmosphere, and the smaller the stomata, the better it is for the plant, because it does not lose so much moisture when it's got small stomata holes. When the stomata holes have to be bigger, because there's, like at the moment, there's less CO2 in the atmosphere, then the stomata holes have to be bigger, and the plant loses more moisture. Okay? So for plants evolved when CO2 in the atmosphere was about 1,500 to 2,000 parts per million. That is the ideal level for plants to live at. Okay, now here we have a stomata record from Cowenberg, published in 2004. And this is the last 2,000 years. Year 2000, the present time is on the right. And the time of Christ, the Roman period, if you like, is on the left. In the middle, we got the medieval warm period. Now, around about 400 AD, you can see that the CO2 level suddenly shot up from 300, where it was in 300 AD. It suddenly shot up in 450 AD. It shot up from 300 parts per million to 400 or 400, even 450 parts per million. Whereas the ice core record is those little round dots there, the hollow dots you can see going across there. Now the ice core record, as you see there, is monotonic. Stays about the same, 280, 290, 300 parts per million the whole time. Whereas the plant stomata record goes up and down, wide variation. This one here, we've got work by Stein's daughter, published in 2013, which shows the ice core record on the right, which if you look closely at the numbers, it varies from 235 parts per million to 255 parts per million. In other words, a 20 part per million range over that period, which is before present, 11,500 to 14,000 years before present. So that is the variation, just 20 parts per million variation in the ice core record. On the left, we've got plant stomata record, and that varies from 200 parts per million to 400 parts per million. So you've got a 200 part per million variation in the plant stomata record, and just a 20 part per million variation in the ice core record over the same period of time. It's good to see these side by side, so you can really understand that the enormous variation that you get in the stomata record for CO2 versus the ice core record, which, as I said, hardly varies and is monotonic. Now, why is the ice core record monotonic for CO2? Well, it's to do with the Hansen diffusion effect. Once the pressure in the firn and then the ice grows as the snow pack gets higher and higher above a certain level, You get an enormous amount of pressure on the ice, and when it gets over 300 bar, that's what you get, the Hansen diffusion effect that tends to smooth out variations in the atmospheric CO2 record. So what you end up with is a monotonic low level of CO2 right through the ice core record. You can see the same thing here. This is work by Wagner. The paper's called Rapid Atmospheric CO2 Changes Associated with the 8,200 years BP cooling effect. So you get rapid atmospheric changes as measured by the plant stomata on the right. And on the left, of course, you've got the monotonic ice core record for CO2, which only varied over this period, 6,500 to 9,000 years before present. Varied from 260, well, I'd say, to 265. Oh, sorry, 270. So it varied about 10 parts per million, whereas the plant stomata record varied from about 275 up to about 330. So much more variation in the as measured by the plant stomata for CO2. Another interesting point about carbon dioxide emissions, the human emissions as they relate to the atmospheric measurements of CO2 that we directly measure at Mauna Loa and also in Tasmania. There was a very large inflection point, as you see here in 2002, where this is anthropogenic emissions of CO2, which, as you know, is only about 5% of all carbon dioxide emissions. 95% are natural. Around 5% are anthropogenic. Now, what happened after 2002 is the massive, rapid development, industrial development of China. China's emissions really went into high gear after 2002. So you've got an inflection point. Before 2002, you've got a slow increase. Then after 2002, after the inflection point, you had a doubling of the rate of anthropogenic emissions. So instead of increasing 1% per year, like they did before 2002, after 2002, the anthropogenic emissions increased more than 2% per year. But the interesting point here is that that inflection point is not represented in the CO2, atmospheric CO2 measurements. The increase year on year has generally been about 2.1 parts per million for a long time, and there's no inflection point seen in the actual measurements, atmospheric measurements of CO2. So that proves really that the anthropogenic emissions have little to do with the atmospheric measurements of CO2.
And possibly irreversible.
This is another Chomsky claim that he's got from the IPCC, obviously. In their reports, they say that the CO2 residence time is hundreds, thousands, they even talk about hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, the CO2 residence time is 5 years. Here's the papers.
So in North Carolina, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a scientific study commissioned by the Coastal Resources Commission, and it estimated that the sea level will rise by 39 inches by the end of the century.
Chomsky doesn't know what he's talking about here. That is unphysical. It can't happen. You know, people say things and they just don't know what they're talking about. During the last, when we came out of the last ice age, 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, the sea level rose about 10 millimeters per year. And that's when there was miles of ice above Eurasia, miles thick and over the North America. And that was melting rapidly. We haven't got that ice today. How can it happen again? How can, it's talking about 12 millimeters per year between now and 2100. It can't happen. There's no indication at all of that, anything like that happening. Now, we've got about 1.5 millimeters of rise per year at the moment. Don't believe the satellite data, which is 3.2, that's nonsense. Tide gauges show it's about 1.3 to 1.6 millimeters per year, and the rate is slowing. Now, this is work by Goretsky, showing the last century of ocean warming, which shows quite clearly the Yoshimura peaking in 1880, 1940, and 2000. And we got the same thing in the Hadkrut 4 50-year annual trend, the Yoshimura cycle, 61-year Yoshimura, peaking in 1880, 1940, it's slightly delayed here, and then 2000 again slightly delayed because this is a 50-year annual trend. Here we've got work by Holgate, which shows widely varying tide gauges from all over the world put together, showing an average of 2 millimeters per year of linear trend. Now, there's no change over time, hardly any change over time. It varies up and down, as I said, with the Yoshimura, but there's no increase, no acceleration in this at all. Now, the world's foremost living expert on sea levels is Niels Axel Mona, and he was the president of INCWA for quite a few years. He says we're going to get by 2100 between minus 50 millimeters and plus 150 millimeters.
The Himalayan glaciers are melting, and in the not-too-distant future, that could threaten the water supplies in South Asia, which are already at dangerously low levels.
Needless to say, Chomsky's wrong again. The Himalayan glaciers are not melting. Even if they were, that's not the source of the river water. That is snow melt. That is the source of the Ganges and the other river water. So it's just ignorance on his part. Estimates of the contribution of the recent sea level rise, 2003-2010, from all melted landed ice, including the Himalayas, which is a tiny part of it, totals just 1.4 millimeters per year. If extrapolated out to 2100, this source adds just 12 centimeters or 120 millimeters to sea level rise. That is the so-called eusteric rise, and then you add to that the thermosteric, which is due to warming, which might be a little more.
We have not only entered the nuclear age, but also the so-called Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which human activity is dramatically changing the environment.
Now, where on earth does Chomsky and all the other alarmists get their Anthropocene nonsense from? This is where they get it from. In the AR5, we've got the summary for policymakers stating that in terms of the greenhouse effect on the Earth, the forcings, 1750 to 2011, that the net anthropogenic forcings amounted to 2.29 watts per square meter. You can see that in this figure. And the total natural forcings over that same period only amounted to 0.05 watts per square meter. Basically, the IPCC are saying that the human effects on the climate system were 2.29 divided by 0.05, which is 45.8 times all the natural effects on the climate system combined over the last 261 years. So in other words, 98% of all climate change over the last 260 years and subsequently in the future, going in the future, 98% of all the forcings which are currently driving climate change are man-made. So that's where they get this Anthropocene. utter nonsense from? Of course, if these figures were true, then you might well call carbon dioxide pollution. It could be called carbon pollution. And if the figures were true, then you would say that CO2 is the climate driver now. But of course, they're not true. Let's say, just for a moment, that the figures are true, and the anthropogenic forcing is plus 2.29 watts per square meter. What temperature increase would that be responsible for over the last 261 years? I've calculated it here for you. It's a change in temperature of 0.59 degrees centigrade. That's what it would be. That's really a maximum, but that's without feedbacks. I'm saying the feedbacks will be negative, but that's assuming these relative forcings are correct. Now we know that in the past climate change has widely varied. There's been enormous variabilities, particularly during ice ages, but even during the Holocene we have widely varying climate. Here, for example, in Oman, we have work by Neff et al., published in 2001, that shows the solar activity proxy, carbon-14 isotope, and its amazing correlation with oxygen-18 isotope, which is a proxy for temperature. So you've got the sun causing temperature change on Earth, and an exact correlation. It's very high. So we know that the sun causes temperature variation on Earth. It's 100% certain. So what can we say then about these forcing relationships between anthropogenic and natural, which is basically TSI, the sun? That's what they cite as being minimal. Well, we can say that both of these figures are probably wrong. Okay, let's start with the TSI. At 0.05 watts per square meter change in 261 years. Well, it is possible. I mean, it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and ends up where it started. So that is possible, but when you look into the literature, you get a completely different story. There's really two possibilities here. Either that TSI changes were not that small, and/or a strong amplifying mechanism exists. As I was saying, a strong solar influence is required to explain the historical records, and the many proxy records which all testify to the reality of large climate variability, right through the historical record, right through the Holocene. Even on decadal timescales, the common Schwab cycle needs an amplifying factor of 3 to explain the signature that is seen in the climate record. The reference here is Douglas and Clader, 2002. This is the positive feedback mechanism from Svensmark's cosmoclimatology hypothesis. And this would give you a 3 to 6 times amplification of any solar activity. Now, if we just look at top of atmosphere TSI changes, the IPCC one is this one, Team et al., 2014, which shows virtually, well, maybe 1 watt per square meter variation, top of atmosphere in TSI, over the last 260 odd years. But if we look at other researchers, for example, Scafetter and Wilson, 2014, we get 5 watts per square meter variation over the same time period, so 5 times greater. And if we look at Herrera, again, we get a large variation, even bigger variation of about 7 watts per square meter. This is Shapiro et al., which shows about 8 watts per square meter since 1690 to the present. Now, what a range top of atmosphere of 7 watts per square meter points to is a surface TSI change of about 1.2 watts per square meter over the last 325 years, for example, which is a factor of 24 times greater than the TSI change reported by the IPCC of 0.05 watts per square meter. 24 times, factor of 24 times. So there could be a factor of 24 out on the TSI. That's not counting amplification, which, as we saw before from cosmoclimatology, could be 3 to 6 times amplification. Now, there's a lot going on in the climate system all the time, of course, and in context, the IPCC's alleged anthropogenic forcing from 1750 to 2011, which is 2.29 watts per square meter, that incidentally equals 0.008 watts per square meter on average per year. But of course, it's been more in the more recent years compared to the earlier years, and it has been actually measured. The CO2 forcing alone has been measured to be, which is most of the forcing, has been measured to be 0.02 watts per square meter per year. That's currently. It's how much the forcing has actually been measured to be. Now, just to put that in context, that's 0.02 watts per meter per year. The known natural forcing every 6 months, due to eccentricity changes, is 16 watts per square meter at the surface. 90 top of atmosphere, but at the surface it's 16. So that is thousands of times larger. And this is why we have a problem measuring the CO2 forcing, which is absolutely minuscule. Now, again, the known natural annual forcing change due to an albedo change, which changes about 3% annually every year, changes about 3%. 1% change in albedo is equal to a forcing of 3.31 watts per square meter. So 3% is 9.93 watts per square meter. I'll explain why that changes annually shortly. Now, the outgoing long-wave radiation has been measured to change within a 1-year period by 80 watts per square meter. And you can see the real scale of the anthropogenic forcing now, which is absolutely minute. As you see there, the typical Arctic OLR change over a 6-month period is 60 watts per square meter, which is 6,000 times the measured change in CO2 forcing over the same time period. Now, a recent paper that I highly recommend you read is by Sidorov, 2014, using seasonal variations to estimate Earth's response to radiative forcing. This is an incredible paper because what it does is it shows the cloud cover differences between the northern and southern hemisphere, and that they actually change in response to the top of atmosphere solar forcing caused by the Earth's eccentricity changes. I know it sounds a bit odd to some people, but what it means is that there's a massive negative feedback in the climate system. And that tells you also a lot about what you need to know about CO2.
China, which is still a huge polluter, is well in the lead in production of solar panels and also development of advanced solar technology. Claims to be phasing out coal plants.
This is the biggest load of tripe that Chomsky, said this hour, and by God, there's been a lot of competition. China is by a long way the world's biggest polluter and emitter. It emits more than twice as much CO2 as the next nearest competition, which is the USA. China emits more CO2 than the USA, Japan, Germany, Russia, Australia and the UK and Canada combined. And they're planning on doubling their CO2 emissions by 2030. So not only do they now emit about 11 billion tons per year compared to the USA's 5, they're going to probably double that by 2030. Everything is made in China because they've got the cheapest, they've got the worst environmental controls on industry, and they've got the lowest, wages. Why wouldn't you build stuff there? I don't know why these leftists don't wake up. Why have they got such a blind spot when it comes to China? And as for China phasing out coal plants, that is just laughable. There's more than 2,000 coal plants being built now or planned globally, and more than half of them, about 1,200 of them, are being built and in the planning stages in China. 1,200. If you know nothing about China, like Chomsky doesn't, what I should do is read something about him. Truth About China, Patricia Adams, for example. Straight from the boss, China's premier. China will end massive expansion in solar and wind due to the huge costs of these and will instead concentrate on nuclear and hydroelectric power from 2012. That's exactly what they've done. So they've gone to nuclear and hydroelectric for their renewables, and for their fossil fuels they've gone to more gas and more coal, in particular coal. They're expanding coal massively. I'm telling you, that's what they're doing, I know, because I know those guys. I know them personally, those at CUMT, China's University of Mining Technology. I know them, I met them last year. All they're thinking about is expanding more and more coal, more and more electricity generation. That's what they're thinking about. So Chomsky's just dreaming. One thing they are doing is they're replacing very polluting coal-fired power stations that are close to cities with the less polluting coal-fired power stations that are further away from cities. That's one thing they are doing to control air pollution, but they're not even thinking about CO2. Being a, quotes, developing country, under the Paris Agreement, they don't need to worry.
Keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade, that's considered the major danger point.
Now, the supposed 2 degrees danger point stipulated by the IPCC is what you might expect. It's something that they pulled out of their wherever. It's got no basis in science at all, and it's just fiction. How would you determine your success? Let's say everyone cut their emissions. We didn't get to 2 degrees. How would you know that we did that? The whole idea is raving mad.
And there are other reasons for optimism. One of them has just been reported by, of all places, Fox News. They ran a poll on popularity of political figures, and in first place, by a huge margin, was Bernie Sanders. Even more among the young, who are the hope of the future. And much of the population is still pretty much where it was pre-World War II. And that's a major task for the educational system. And the prospects right now, at least, don't look good, not with the DeVos, Sessions, Bannon conception of education. The Trump administration has to do something for its huge evangelical popular base that involves driving the United States even farther off the spectrum of the modern world with the Talibanization project that's now underway.
The first question is, how many of you have a car in this room?
Sorry?
How many of you have a car in this room?
Couldn't hear it.
And how many of you run your car at least 5 minutes to warm up while you're getting ready?
Can you hear it?
How many of you use paper or plastic plates? And how many of you replace their cell phones every year?
Question? Okay.
I'm sorry, but I didn't hear.
There was no question, I guess, for you.
What do you think about the meddling, the Kremlin in our election?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Could anybody?
The meddling of Russia, the Kremlin in our 2016 election.
I'm sorry, but I don't.
The meddling of Russia allegedly in our elections.
Oh, the meddling of Russia in our elections. That has most of the world cracking up in laughter. You know, it's just a joke. You know? I mean, literally.